Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with a video about a topic that I'm personally pretty passionate about, and that is history. And I've been thinking about doing some videos on historical topics for a while now, and just wasn't really sure how I wanted to kick things off, and decided, you know what, let's try something a little simple, a little easy, and a little laid back, and do some history versus Warhammer. Because obviously Warhammer does draw quite a bit of inspiration from historical sources, from various historical nations, weapons, technology, all sorts of stuff. In some cases, ridiculously sort of parodied. In some cases, perhaps a little more nuanced or serious. But regardless, it's definitely all over the place. And at first I had a few ideas floating around in my head, but when the new Hunter and the Beast DLC was announced, I immediately knew what I wanted to do. War Wagons. Because honestly, they're a pretty fun and interesting vehicle throughout history. From their very basic wagon logger usage straight up to the pretty advanced, in some cases, tactics used during the Hussite Wars. They were a pretty serious threat in some cases, and I felt like it would be worth it to explore that history, to look at this historical inspiration from the earliest war chariots or vehicles defined as war chariots, right up through their zenith during the Hussite Wars, and even their usage into relatively modern times. After that, we're also going to be looking at how the Warhammer war wagons compare, whether or not they would perhaps have a function, or if they're just sort of a ridiculous rule of cool unit within the context of their lore. Regardless, I do hope you guys enjoy, and without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, first and foremost, before we really dive into this topic as a whole, I think it's important that we get some definitions down for what really qualifies as a war wagon. And I know some of you guys might be thinking, well, that's ridiculous, it's a wagon, how hard can it be? But when one looks at what certain historians write, as well as what is sometimes described as a war wagon, it's important to keep in mind that it's not always just a vehicle pulled by beasts of burden that's open and has space for a crew to fight from. In some cases, such as in the one of our first instances here, the Dongwu-che, it's described as a war wagon, but it doesn't require any beasts of burden. It's simply, essentially, a moving fort, and it's described as a war wagon by many historians. So we're going to be mentioning some of these units, giving them a little bit of time. However, chariots, which in some cases war wagons were utilized in a chariot-esque manner. However, chariots were definitely designed for a different type of warfare, and while very prominent, and in some cases even dominant during the periods of antiquity, we saw them used in large quantities by the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Chinese utilized them. The Persians, of course, were infamous for their use of chariots, and even the Celts in northwestern Europe were known to utilize war chariots, though they use them more as a method of transport than an actual combat vehicle. But while this was a very significant part of warfare, I don't think it really translates to being a war wagon. So I did want to make those things clear before we continue on with our discussion. Now, where to begin with chariots? Now, the first example I'm going to use is that almost non-chariot, and it's actually from the Far East in China. A vehicle known as the Dongwu-che. I do apologize if my pronunciations are horrid, but it was basically a large mobile battlefield shield. It was more akin to some of the siege, protective siege vehicles we saw during siege work, such as, for example, the protective pavises or shields used to protect rams, to protect sappers attempting to undermine a city's walls, to simply protect soldiers bringing ladders up to a wall, that sort of thing. And the main difference with this vehicle, though, the Dongwu-che, was that it was utilized in a battlefield role. It was actually utilized in field battle. And this is something that's kind of unusual. Obviously, these siege vehicles were very prominent, and they were used quite often in sieges. That is what they're siege vehicles. That's what they were designed for. But the Dongwu-che, it was basically just an enclosed box with some frontal shield and some roof protection that would have a crew of men who were armed with pole arms as well as various projectile weaponry, and would fight from within the safety of this protective barrier. And interestingly enough, it was supposedly used in field battles during the 5th century BC in China, and perhaps even later than that. And although there aren't many great descriptions of it, it certainly was an interesting early example of a sort of fighting vehicle or fighting platform. Whether or not you want to describe it as a wagon is a little debatable. One of the things I wasn't able to find is if it actually had a floor or an internal platform, or if the crew simply had to push it along and stop to fight, or some had to be pushing while some were fighting on the move, I guess. But it wasn't necessarily described. It wasn't something I was able to discern, which I think would cement a little more whether or not this would be more in the style of a war wagon or just a protective shield. But regardless, I did feel it was worth mentioning in this video and give it, and certainly was an innovative solution and idea for the time. Something you don't really see replicated all that often around. Usually you'll see more mobile sort of shield-based formations rather than a full-on vehicle designed for the purpose. Now, our second and final major example from the East, and we're going to do this before jumping back to the West, is one from the 8th century AD at the Battle of Shentou, where the Tang official Fang Wan, chancellor at the time, was ordered to suppress some rebellions, and supposedly he attempted to use war chariots to replicate the strategies of antiquity. He used war chariots en masse. This was the 8th century of AD, so of course they were already somewhat obsolete at that time, but you guys might be thinking, why are we talking about chariots? You said we're not going to cover chariots early on. Well, here's the catch. Based on the fact that Fang Wan supposedly only had 3 weeks to prepare for this attack against the rebel holdings, as well as the fact that the chariots supposedly had very little impact. There were mention of them being pulled by oxen. It's suspected that what he actually attempted to do, rather than making 2,000 chariots, because he is in the space of 3 weeks, was that he attempted to utilize conventional wagons pulled by oxen in an offensive manner. Now, the Battle of Shentou was an absolute disaster. Fang Wan was defeated, or Fang Wan's forces were defeated. He lost approximately 40,000 men. It was an absolutely abysmal sight. But the fact that he was attempting to use wagons in a chariot-esque or a offensive manner could explain some of this, because the problem with one of the big problems with ox-drawn wagons is the fact they're incredibly slow. Moving as little as 2 miles an hour, really, you can't rely on that in a tactical situation to function as an offensive vehicle. You get outmaneuvered by infantry, much less cavalry. Basically, everything is far more mobile. It makes you a very vulnerable target, and it would explain why his forces were so easily picked apart. Now, obviously, it wasn't the only factor. There were many other factors. Fang Wan had a lack of experience, especially among his command staff. Certainly, his forces were quite a bit disorganized. There was all sorts of other factors in play, but I do think it is worth mentioning that these vehicles were used. It's interesting to see wagons attempted to be used in an offensive manner, and they failed, but still, it was an attempt to utilize war wagons, and it is a very early example of an offensive use of war wagons. Because as we jump back to the West, we're going to see them take on a much more static function, and that is kind of going to be the defining feature of war wagons. Now, the first example we are going to mention here of in the West of the use of wagons in warfare, not even necessarily war wagons, is at the Battle of Adrianople. This is one of the earliest instances of a wagon logger or wagon fort being utilized. On the 9th of August, 378 AD, there was a Gothic encampment near the town of Adrianople set up on a hill, and it was protected by a wagon fort. And this would kind of define most of the future uses of wagons in warfare. Obviously, armies had their baggage trains. In many cases, nomadic tribes had their own supply trains and supply vehicles that would be moving along, carrying their belongings, their tools, all their food supplies, all sorts of stuff. And so wagon forts were basically just an improvised defense. You had wagons. When you stopped for the day, you could draw them up in a circle, or depending on the terrain, some sort of protective formation, and have basically a portable a portafort. You'd have a portable fortification, and at the Battle of Adrianople, the Goths were encamped in this sort of wagon laager or wagon fort. The Romans attempted to advance on them, were very complacent and disorganized. The Gothic counterattack, they only a handful of Roman troops even reached the fort because the Goths sallied out and counterattacked, and the Gothic cavalry crushed much of the Roman army pretty handily. It was quite the disaster for the Romans, but I don't think it can really be attributed to the wagons. It's simply an interesting case because it's the first real recorded case of a wagon fort explicitly being used in a battlefield scenario. However, it can be inferred, I think, from this that using wagons in a defensive purpose was around for quite a bit before then, especially among nomadic tribes such as the Goths. Now, similar instances continue to occur throughout history for the next, really millennia and a half if we push it all the way through to modern or near modern times. But we have examples, for example. I really shouldn't be allowed to talk sometimes. But in Bulgaria in 1122 at the Battle of Beroia, the Pechenegs, who were fighting against the Byzantines, were utilizing wagon forts for defensive purposes. And we actually have detailed descriptions of the Byzantines breaking through these wagon forts with a sort of decisive concerted assault. There's descriptions of the Emperor Comnenus at the time leading his Varangian guard to break through the chains that were holding these wagons together and open up a gap for the rest of his troops to pour through. And this is basically how wagon warfare goes throughout much of the Middle Ages, essentially. From the late Roman period, like the Battle of Adrianople, through to really the 15th century when the Hussite Wars come into play. Wagon forts were not really a key part of a battlefield strategy. It was simply something you did on a strategic level because while an army was on the move, it was obviously kind of vulnerable. You had these wagons, so you might as well draw them up, use them in a protective fashion to make an encampment. This was done by the Pechenegs, as we saw in this instance. It was a pretty common tactic in especially in more open areas where you had more room for deploying these wagon forts. So especially in like Poland, Lithuania, Russia, you saw them used more so in the areas of the Middle East, Asia Minor. You'd ultimately see them used by armies like the Ottomans, but the concept was the same. It wasn't really used in a battlefield function. It was more like if your opponent caught you with your pants down, or they would attack you, and you would have a prepared fortification. But it wasn't sort of a intentional part of a battlefield strategy. It wasn't where an army would go out with the goal of utilizing their wagons in a battlefield role. And it kind of makes sense. Without much in the way of artillery, that you don't really have a way to force your opponent's attack. Without the mobility, which most of these wagons weren't dedicated military vehicles, they were towed by oxen. Without mobility, you can't really use it in a offensive manner. As we saw at the Battle of Shantou, this could end disastrously. And so yeah, wagons were kind of relegated to this defensive role. But this all kind of got shaken up when the Hussite Wars kicked off in late 1419. And that's really going to be the next segment here, because I believe this is where the Imperial War Wagon in Warhammer really draws its inspiration, and this is really going to be the defining moment, the zenith of wagon warfare, and a moment in which it actually becomes a key strategy. Now, before we dive into the Hussite War Wagons and why they became and how they became such a critical component of Hussite strategy, I think it is important to have a little bit of context as to the conflict in which they were being used. The Hussite Wars were one of the first religious conflicts of the Reformation, and they were initiated in late 1419 as a result of seemingly irreconcilable differences between the various followers of Catholic reformer Jan, or in English sometimes called John Hus, and the Catholic Church. Now, Jan Hus was arrested and executed in 14 at the Council of Constance. Or more accurately, the Council of Constance expelled him and handed him over to civil authorities, who then executed him for heresy. And this was despite promises of safe conduct by the King of Germany at the time, King Sigismund. From there on out, the situation between his followers and Catholic loyalists would deteriorate rather rapidly over the course of just 4 years. At first, it was minor skirmishes, protests, and riots, but ultimately it would escalate into full-blown warfare following the First Defenestration of Prague. This was an act that shocked the king at the time, King Václav, or Wenceslas for the English speakers, so greatly that he died shortly thereafter. From there, the Hussites would arm rapidly, especially the more radical elements. Oftentimes inspired by their pastors, priests, or preachers. At the same time, Catholic forces loyal to King Sigismund, who would be crowned King of Bohemia in the wake of his brother Wenceslas' death, and at the time was also King of Hungary, Germany, and Croatia, he began moving against them, and the first of 5 crusades to be launched against the Hussites was declared in March of 1420, with the papal bull ordering the crusade to eradicate all Wycliffites, Hussites, and other such heretics in Bohemia. Now, the Hussites found themselves in a bit of a bind. Their military force, such as it was largely composed of peasantry and militarily inexperienced townsfolk. They did have some aristocrats on their side, some of which may have had some military experience, but this group was relatively small and, in comparison to the whole, insignificant. The Hussites were also rather heavily outnumbered by the incoming crusaders. King Sigismund was able to draw upon forces from all over his vast domain, as well as mercenaries from outside of the Holy Roman Empire. Ultimately, King Sigismund would become Holy Roman Emperor, so that was where many of his forces were being drawn from. On top of this, of course, the qualitative edge he possessed between the various knightly orders, knights and mercenaries, men-at-arms that marched alongside him to fight against the Hussites. It looked like the Hussite rebellion was essentially doomed to fail. Now, fortunately, the Hussites did have some advantages, and most significant of these was their leadership. And the most significant of these leaders was a man named Jan Žižka. He was a member of the lower aristocracy, and he already possessed some military experience. Now, how much of this military experience he possessed is debated. His early life is not particularly well documented. However, it is known that he fought at the Battle of Grunwald alongside the Polish-Lithuanian forces against the Teutonic Order. This was a defeat for the Teutonic Order and essentially sealed their long-term fate as a power in that area. And from this, it's likely he learned a lot about the tactics and strategies that would be employed by his foes. It's also possible that he actually learned about the wagon lager from the Poles and the Lithuanians, because they utilized this strategy quite a bit at the time. Now, granted, in that improvised defensive manner, as we discussed previously, but still, it was something they did rather often, where it was a less common strategy in Western or Central Europe. Now, understanding this likelihood of what his opponents would do, as well as the severe limitations of his resources and troops, Žižka and his officers, or those elected to be his officers, the Hussites actually elected their own leadership, set about attempting to transform a group of essentially peasant rabble into an effective military force. Now, this came on multiple levels. On the most base level, things such as agricultural tools, such as the agricultural flail, were converted into weapons of war. This was because, one, the Hussites didn't have access to many conventional weapons, but also because the peasants were simply not trained in their use. It was ultimately oftentimes easier to teach a peasant how to use a tool he'd been using for years than a tool that would have been new to him, even if it was a relatively simple weapon, such as a polearm. On top of this, firearms were procured, and this is perhaps one of the first significant changes implemented. This was quite a wide variety of black powder weaponry. Now, obviously, black powder weaponry was not new to European warfare. It had been around for basically a century at that point, maybe even more. It was even used in a battlefield role at the Battle of Crécy in 1346 by the English against the French, so certainly wasn't a novel idea. However, small arms were not really used, and this was something that Žižka would make very heavy use of with his forces. And artillery had also conventionally been used in a siege function, whereas Žižka made it a significant part of his battlefield strategy. Now, perhaps the most important key to his reworking of the Hussite military force was the implementation of the war wagon. And these were much more dedicated military vehicles. Each could hold between 1 and 2 dozen men, armed with a mix of polearms, crossbows, and firearms. These lighter small arms were called pistoly, or flutes by the Czechs. Ultimately, this is where supposedly the word pistol comes from. And these wagons provided the infantry inside with a degree of protection against enemy attacks, both at range as well as in close quarters. Oftentimes their sides would be raised so as to provide additional protection and make it more difficult for the opponent to reach the troops inside. These raised sides would also provide their troops with an area on which they could brace their weapons. Keep in mind, early firearms, even though it was a quote-unquote small arm, would still be pretty clumsy and unwieldy and difficult to handle. Now, on top of this, the Hussites made very heavy use of artillery, as we discussed before, and these cannons, or these Hofnitzer, they were called, or howitzers, would have been positioned in between the wagons in the wagon wall, or vozová hradba. That's what it would be called in Czech, vozová hradba, but it literally just means wagon wall. The Hussites would then effectively have a fortress that they could deploy anywhere they wanted to. Now, the artillery in this actually had a key role, and the Hussite strategy would actually revolve almost entirely around this synergy of gunpowder weapons, artillery, wagons, and a core reserve of cavalry and infantry. At first, they would deploy their wagon wall or wagon fort. From there, the artillery would begin to attack their foes at range, forcing them to advance. This is something previously wagon walls or wagon forts were very limited in their usage because you couldn't force your opponent to advance, really. It was a purely defensive option. However, with the usage of black powder artillery, Žižka was able to bombard his foes, and this meant that they were either forced to advance or otherwise suffer through bombardment or withdraw. Now, usually the result was that the enemy advanced, and attempting to advance was often disastrous, because at that point Hussite artillery as well as small arms would inflict massive casualties on the approaching troops, who, even once they did reach the wagon wall, faced an incredibly difficult task of attempting to breach the wagon fort. And this is tough because the wagons would be drawn rather close together. There was only a few narrow choke points to which the enemy could advance. The Hussites, of course, maintained reserve cavalry and infantry within the wagon fort, which would be helping hold any potential breaches. And of course, getting over top of these relatively tall and heavy wagons was quite difficult for the enemy. Once the enemy attack was defeated, the final phase of the battle would then begin, and the Hussite reserves would sally out and pursue the enemy into oblivion. And now this was obviously a tactic that was rather innovative at the time. It was a relatively offensive usage of war wagons. Now, obviously, it still relied on getting the enemy to attack you first. However, the Hussites would force them to advance with the use of artillery. We see similar cases in, for example, the Battle of Agincourt, where the English actually pushed forward and began to harass the French with longbow fire. And this was essentially what the Hussites were doing, just on a massive scale, and they were doing so repeatedly. It also relied a lot on the Hussites' discipline. This was one of the benefits. Many of them, especially the more hardline elements of the Hussite forces, were definitely what could be described as religious zealots, and the discipline was often actually very good. The Hussites organized them alongside sort of military lines, and as such, were generally pretty disciplined. And this was very critical. Good old faith, gunpowder, and steel, and it was seeing the Hussites through victory after victory. The first recorded usage of these wagons was the Battle of Nekmir in late 1419, even before the first anti-Hussite crusade was declared. Perhaps, and this was the first battle where Žižka sort of showed his military competence, and this was one of the reasons why he would be elected as really one of the primary leaders or hetman of the Hussite forces. Now, ultimately, he would climb in ranks. Perhaps one of the first significant, or much better remembered, I suppose, of victories of the Hussites with the war wagon would come in early 1420 at the Battle of Sudomiesh. Here, the Hussites found themselves outnumbered 400 to 2,000. And this was including the women and children within the group. And the enemy force, composed of Knights Hospitaller as well as various Catholic cavalrymen, attempted to engage upon the Hussites. Now, Žižka took advantage of the muddy terrain by Sudomiesh to limit the enemy's avenues of advance, and he then fortified with a wagon fort. And as the enemy advanced across the muddy ground, they found themselves mucked up, unable to advance quickly, gunned down, and ultimately forced into a bloody and costly retreat. And this would be the sort of first major or large victory for the Hussites with these wagon tactics. And it would be something that we'd see repeated over and over and over again for the next decade and a half, essentially, of warfare that raged during the Hussite Wars. You even saw it after Zizka's death at battles such as Uski Nadlabem or Ausigen. And it should be noted, however, that the war wagons were not strictly limited to a static role. One of the other big changes that I did not mention earlier was the fact that Hussite war wagons were towed by horses, and this allowed far greater mobility than what was afforded by ox-towed wagons, both in a tactical as well as a strategic function. Strategically, a perfect example of this is the Hussite march to Domažlice. The Hussite armies seeking to relieve the siege of that city marched 80 kilometers in a mere 2 days. Now, for those of you who are looking at this from a mile perspective, that is about 50 miles or almost 2 marathons in 2 days. This would not have been possible with, or likely not have been possible with, ox-drawn wagons. But with the horse-drawn wagons, the Hussites had a significant edge in mobility that they could take advantage of. This mobility would also prove useful in a tactical role. A perfect example of this was the Battle of Kutna Hora. Here, the Hussites found themselves encircled by enemy forces. The King Sigismund had encircled them, and the situation looked bleak for those sides. It looked like they were going to be trapped. Now, granted, their artillery was holding the enemy off. They were not dead yet, but it was clear to Zizka that they need to break out or die. So, Zizka grouped his wagons into a column and launched a devastating charge through Sigismund's lines. Guns blazing, the wagons plowed through the king's army and open a path for the remaining Hussite forces to escape. And this showed that in a pinch, they could be utilized in an offensive role. If we compare this, for example, to the Battle of Shintao, where Fang Guan attempted to use ox-drawn wagons in an offensive role, supposedly, and there was met by disaster. But here, with the fact that he had all this extra mobility and the advantage of surprise, Zizka was able to use this sort of innovative tactic to bust through enemy lines and get clear of the fight. And ultimately, these war wagon tactics, whether innovative and unique, like the breakout at Kutna Hora, or relatively static and defensive, such as at Uski Nadlabem or Sudomierz. Either way, these would become the sort of key component of Hussite strategy and would ultimately earn them a fearsome reputation. And when I say fearsome, I mean fearsome, terrifying. The enemy at the Battle of Takhov, for example, which was during one of the later crusades launched against the Hussites, in fact suffered massive losses to desertion, and much of their force began to run away over time, sort of trickling away at the thought of fighting the Hussites. It was even more severe at the Battle of Domažlice. Here, the mere sound of the Hussites approaching, singing their religious hymns, was enough to scare away the crusading force, or at least the majority of it. And as a result, the victory was very decisive and very easy for those sides. And it shows just how terrifying their reputation was. Ultimately, it would take Hussites to truly beat Hussites. The moderate Utraquist Hussites, who were seeking to reproach with the Catholic Church, would defeat the radical Taborites at the Battle of Lipan. And they did so by baiting them out of their wagon fortress. Both sides, of course, understood each other's tactics, and the Utraquists managed to bait out and get their brethren out from their wagon fort and destroy them in the ensuing battle. This would ultimately bring an end to the Hussite Wars. However, although the Hussites made peace with the Catholic Church, the wagon fort would continue to find usage in the field because the Hussites would become much sought after mercenaries. The Hussite ideology had spread quite a bit. They were not simply relegated to Bohemia, but there were also Hussites in Slovakia, Moravia, Poland even, and many of these, the bordering countries as well, had suffered Hussite attacks because the Hussites didn't simply take the imperial attacks lying down. They often counterattacked in what they called beautiful rides or krasny jízdy into bordering countries to punish them for supporting the emperor's forces. And as such, their reputation was fearsome, and many of the surrounding nations began to hire them out as mercenaries in an effort to replicate their success or take advantage of their military prowess. And we'd see this all over. The Poles would often recruit them. We would see them utilized at the Battle of Varna, where Protestants, or the Hussites, Catholics, and Orthodox Christians fought side by side against the Ottoman Empire, though to their defeat at Varna. Granted, this didn't have much to do with the wagon fort, but rather the overall Varna Crusades tactics, but still, it is a worthwhile mention. They'd also be employed by standing armies, such as the Black Army of Hungary, and this method of warfare was greatly exported. Now, the death knell of the war wagon, however, would ultimately come in the early 16th century, and it would be a result of a combination of factors. Now, first and foremost, perhaps, is the lack of flexibility in terrain where road networks were either unavailable or limited, as well as where open fields were limited. The war wagons, especially the wagon fort, required a good amount of space to deploy. It required a good amount of space to move around, and this was often more limited in Western and Central Europe. Granted, Zizka made it work, even in some often abusing the terrain, in fact, such as in the case of Sudomierz. However, it was still a very significant limitation. And in comparison, the disciplined pike and shot infantry that was becoming standard at the time, the pike and shot era of warfare was sort of beginning in the 16th century, was significantly more flexible and mobile. A wagon fort was ultimately static, and the defensive benefits it provided could be replicated in large part by pike and shot infantry. And another problem was that the war wagon was designed for what was essentially a small and limited army, but most European armies didn't really have this issue. So most of the significant combatants in Europe just weren't that starved for numbers, so they weren't as reliant on the war wagon. Now, furthermore, field artillery became much more common, and this was a huge killer for war wagons. Station, obviously being a static target, wagons were very easy prey and very easy pickings for enemy artillery. Granted, perhaps they could counter battery the enemy with their own artillery, but still, a wagon fort is a much larger and easier target, even for artillery of the time period, and this is a big limiting factor. It meant that against well-equipped armies in the European era, it was not really a viable strategy anymore. Granted, perhaps with some more inspired leadership or discipline, such as that of Zizka, who utilized the wagons in unconventional means at some times, maybe the wagon could have persevered a little longer, but this was simply not available. When utilized in a traditional static function, wagons were just not that viable. Now, that is not to say war wagons were completely useless, or certainly that this mobile fortress warfare was completely useless. It continued to see much use out in the steppes, out in Russia, Poland, out in the Ottoman Empire, oftentimes utilized against tribesmen or groups such as the Tatars, who often lacked the heavy artillery or the weaponry and discipline to really break the wagon forts. The Russians even had, I believe it was called the Gulaya Gorod. It was essentially just mobile walls. It wasn't even a wagon. It was just wooden walls on wheels that they'd pieced together into a mobile fortress. And this was an extension of this wagon logger strategy. And they utilized this against the Tatars in many of their conflicts. So certainly the strategy didn't die down in many of these peripheral conflicts, but as a major battlefield strategy, it was the wagon logger, the war wagon was essentially dead. Now, they would see a bit of resurgence during the 18th and 19th centuries, during the period of colonial warfare. Obviously, circling the wagons was a popular defensive measure among American settlers, whether to defend against Native American attack, bandits, whatever. And it was also popular in Africa. Perhaps the most famous example of this tactic, the wagon logger tactic, and really where we get logger from, is from the Battle of Blood River, which happened on December 16th in 1838. And this was the case where fewer than 500 Boers would hold off 10,000 Zulus from a wagon fort. And it showed that when faced with enemies that didn't have the firepower or didn't necessarily have the organization or whatever was needed to breach a wagon fort, it would remain a devastating method of warfare, and it could still be very, very competitive. However, obviously, as the lineup of opponents who couldn't breach the fort sort of ran out as the colonial era drew to an end by the mid to late 19th century, wagon forts essentially died off. Now, there was a slight resurgence of the wagon tactic well, I say a wagon tactic. This is being very generous because it's not necessarily a wagon tactic, but in late World War I, as well as the Russian Civil War and the Soviet-Polish conflict and many of the smaller wars that occurred during the early 1920s, late 1918, 1919, that sort of era, we did see the usage of a vehicle called the Tachanka. Now, this was not used in a wagon fort manner. So that to compare it to war wagons is definitely a bit of a stretch. However, it was simply a wagon or a carriage with a machine gun slapped on top, and it was designed to be a mobile method of transporting a machine gun alongside cavalry, and utilized to counteract enemy enemy cavalry and infantry, and give greater flexibility to machine guns in an era where normal road vehicles were still, or cars and armored cars and tanks and that sort of thing, were still rather limited. It was such a popular concept that the Poles actually had, I believe, 2 variants that were manufactured in factories that were actually not improvised. Early Tachankas were an improvised affair, but having an actual dedicated build was interesting. Obviously, these didn't last long. Some of the last examples used were supposedly in 1939 against the German invasion. However, I think it is worth mentioning, and whether you want to consider it a part of wagon warfare or chariot warfare, or just not even consider it comparable, I think it does deserve at least an honorable mention for being a sort of last cry of this sort of horse-drawn strategy in a true combat role. Obviously, horses were still used for towing artillery pieces and that sort of thing, but for an actual battlefield role. And because of that, I do believe it deserves a mention. Now, with that out of the way, let's dive into the Imperial War Wagon and see how it compares to its historical counterparts. Now, clearly, the Imperial version is a dedicated combat vehicle, rather than a logistical wagon. It is obviously towed by horses, which is very important for its mobility. It also appears to have a very heavily reinforced structure. Now, Warhammer being Warhammer, it looks, quite frankly, ridiculous, but it still is apparently designed to be a weapon of war. And because of this, it definitely would have some military advantages as a combat vehicle for the Empire. Now, that said, its design is a bit ridiculous. And I say bit, I mean very ridiculous. Definitely very short, very tall. This would most likely be a significant stability issue. Make deploying it in a defensive manner very tough. Make using it in an offensive manner near impossible. Something people often underestimate is how important center of gravity can be for a vehicle. One of the few real problems with the M4 Sherman, for example, was its center of gravity. And in fact, Soviet tank ace Dmitry Lozal lists the fact that the tank could and sometimes did tip over if not driven very carefully. And this definitely seems to be something that would probably plague the Imperial War Wagon. It's just so tall, just so clumsy looking. The chassis is so narrow. I really couldn't see it holding up well. Now, it's also relatively small for a War Wagon, especially when compared to its Hussite peers. Only having like a 6-man crew or so compared to about half a dozen or 2 dozen. So about a quarter of the size, really. And finally, the usage of artillery on it is a bit suspect. Hellblaster, maybe it's basically a small arm, just a lot of them strapped together, but something like a mortar especially seems very unlikely. It seems like something that would destroy a wagon. Historically, wagons did not really utilize heavy artillery. Now, there's some debate about lighter pieces being used. Oftentimes, especially in the 15th century, it's hard to tell exactly what qualifies as a light artillery piece and what qualifies as small arm. The border between the two is often blurry because many of those early small arms were very, very unwieldy. However, heavy weapons such as the mortar would definitely not have been used. The recoil would be enough, most likely, to destroy a wagon. And the idea that the Empire's war wagons would somehow manage this, unless they have like serious magical support or something, it seems very unlikely. Or some sort of stabilizers or whatever to brace them. Now, as for tactical usage, I think the Empire is in many ways an ideal candidate for such warfare. Obviously, in the world of Warhammer, magic and monsters pose a major threat, but the vast majority of the Empire's enemies are exactly the sort of brutal rush factions against which a wagon fort is ideal. Many of them rely on massive numbers and frontal assaults, and this is really one of the things a wagon fort greatly mitigates and helps restrict. Armies such as, outside of an ambush, an army such as Greenskins, Chaos, Counts, Norskins, Beastmen, or even Dark Elves and Bretonnians with which the Empire's most skirmishes don't have the tools to crack a wagon fort very effectively or efficiently. Now, obviously, there are some armies that probably could. The Dwarves, the Skaven, though obviously the Empire doesn't really fight the Dwarves very much. I know there's some cases in the lore, but still, not very common. And even against the Skaven, the Empire does have a significant artillery lineup, so it could potentially counterbarrel the opponent and prevent them from utilizing that artillery advantage to crack a wagon fort. And because of this, I think in many ways, it makes sense that the Empire would use war wagons. Now, obviously, many of the foes it is fighting against are far more horrific, powerful, or determined than mere men. Obviously, something like a Black Orc or a Chaos Chosen, or I don't know, a zombie or whatever, is probably far more suicidal, and in some cases definitely far more dangerous, something like a Black Orc or Chosen for sure, than a knight or a mercenary or a Zulu warrior would have been. But still, I do believe that many of these armies would struggle to breach a well-deployed wagon logger, and because of this, I think it makes very good sense that the Empire would use wagon forts in their warfare. And that draws things to close. I think if the Imperial War Wagon was a little better designed, it didn't look so ridiculous, I could see it completely being a viable approach for them to fight. Now, hopefully you guys did enjoy the video. Hopefully you found it entertaining, informative, and interesting. If you have your own comments, critiques, if you have your own sort of input you'd like to pitch in, feel free to put it in. Obviously I didn't cover all war wagons by far, or all usage. The wagon logger was a pretty common tactic throughout history, and there are many examples of its usage. I tried to just pick out some of the highlights, and of course the Hussite warfare, because that is really the zenith of wagon warfare. But obviously feel free to share your own input. If you guys have your own ideas for what you'd like to see historically, feel free to put them down below. Not sure if you guys are that interested in it or not, but still, I personally find it fascinating. It's likely I'll be doing more videos on the topic, and hopefully you guys do find them fun. I do thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.